All right, welcome everyone. This is the Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer, episode two. I posted episode one the other day and just want to continue talking about the life of Napoleon Hill and some of the claims surrounding his life from modern day critics. Just as a recap, I read Think and Grow Rich in 2020, applied the principles of the book. There's 13 principles of success. He studied and interviewed and was mentored by over 500 very wealthy titans of the early 21st century who taught him the principles that they used to become wealthy. And over a 29-year period, he actually compiled that into a book called The Law of Success in 1928, and then condensed the book down to a more sellable version in Think and Grow Rich in 1937. I read the book in 2020 during the pandemic. And when I went back to car sales from being laid off because of the pandemic, my income actually multiplied by eight. So I found tremendous success in applying the principles, not only financially, but in my own life personally, as well too in my relationships, in my peace of mind, and in other areas of my life. So I knew that the principles worked. But when I began to read articles and kind of look at the background story of Napoleon Hill, I found more information shaming him and actually saying to stay away from his works than I did promoting his work. And a lot of popular people promote him today, from Mark Cuban, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks, and Damon John, and a lot of the sharks from Shark Tank, and Tony Robbins and Russell Brunson. However, what you'll get if you type in Napoleon Hill, the first article you'll see is an article called Napoleon Hill, the Greatest Self-Help Scammer of All Time. That is the most populated and generated article that will come up in a Google search if you Google his name. And if you Google him in YouTube, what will come up are several YouTube videos, maybe 20 of them, that just say that, hey, while Think and Grow Rich is a great book, Napoleon Hill was a fraud and a scammer and not who he really said he was. They mentioned that he was arrested several times. His business dealings with South and were scams. He was married several times, and that he never met any of the people that he claimed to meet, except for Thomas Edison. But there's you know, a variable to that. So they say, oh, he really didn't know him personally. He just happened to meet him on a whim. And so we address all of that in the book because what happened when I began to read that stuff is I didn't want to associate with or to give credit to something that had such a profound impact on my life if it was, generated and originated by a charlatan or a scammer or a fraud or what have you. I didn't want to be promoting, hey, you should read this book because it will really help your life if the author of that book was not genuine. So I really wanted to find out about the man Napoleon Hill, and I did just that over a 2 or 3 year period. Wrote the book, The Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer, which is available on Amazon, and I wanted to give a visual version of that. So I'm just going to go through the next claim in the article, Napoleon Hill, the greatest self-help scammer of all time, and kind of go through my book as well too as a parallel that comments on that claim. So let me just share my screen here, and this is the article that we've been looking at, and I'll just show you here that it's from Paleo Future. And if you just look up the Untold Story of Napoleon Hill, the greatest self-help scammer of all time, this is by Matt Novak. The second claim he makes um, about Hill is that he was said to be an advisor to two presidents, Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, the president. Hill even claimed that he came up with FDR's most famous phrase, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Hill was a charlatan through and through. In fact, there's no evidence whatsoever that Hill met President Wilson or President Roosevelt. He says there's no evidence whatsoever that Hill met President Wilson or President Roosevelt. I'm very curious as how he made that statement and what research and to what extent that he did research to find out that there was no evidence whatsoever, let alone acted as trusted advisors to both. There's little evidence Hill ever met any famous person he claimed was an inspiration for his work outside of Thomas Edison, but we'll get to that later. So I wanted to address this claim that he never met Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or President Roosevelt, and any famous person he claimed was an inspiration for his work. So we'll just assume that it's people like Henry Ford and also Andrew Carnegie. So I'll touch on that a little bit. So if I was to switch over here, I'm going to stop sharing and then I'll share the pages, the corresponding pages from the Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer. So if you'll see here, this is an article um, from May 10th, 1905. And you'll see that Woodrow Wilson is on the board of directors of Andrew Carnegie's. Um, he had an educational foundation, so where he had college presidents actually give to teachers who couldn't afford to live regular lives or afford the cost of living. So Woodrow Wilson is a part of that. So it just shows that Woodrow Wilson is um, it just shows that Woodrow Wilson knew Andrew Carnegie. But in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer, we'll just read through it, some of the details here, and I may skip over some stuff. So Hill had a candy business that failed. And then I just start off in chapter 5 saying that after his candy business failed, and I'll blow this up a little bit, just bear with me here. All right. After his candy business failed, Hill wanted his next business venture to be a school of advertising and salesmanship. He had already prepared a course to teach, but needed $25,000 to open his school. So he opens this school and starts a college called the George Washington Institute. And what he does is he partners with a school called Bryan and Stratton. Now, many of you may be familiar because they're still around today, but he partnered with them. And what he would do is just use their building for his school called the George Washington Institute and taught the students, advertising. So he taught advertising and marketing in this school and used the building out of the Bryan and Stratton building. All right. So when students were interested and requested a free personal analysis chart, they would receive a copy of Hill's first book. It was actually a booklet because it wasn't a full-size book. But Hill's very first book, I know we're all familiar with Think and Grow Rich, but his very first book was called From Poverty to $10,000 a Year. And he wrote this book in 1916. All right, so that was the very first book he wrote in 1916, From Poverty to $10,000 a Year. So in the book, Hill detailed his professional journey from working in a coal mine for $1 a day, or about $37 per day, or $13,505 per year in 2024, to earning $10,000 a year. That's around $288,000 in 2024 when I wrote this. So he then wrote his third booklet entitled How to Sell Your Services while he was president of George Washington Institute. To market the book, he wrote to some of the successful men he knew, requesting letters of endorsement from them. So after he wrote How to Sell Your Services in 1917, he writes successful men that he knew for letters of endorsement. The men who responded included Henry Ford, a very famous person who created the Ford automobile, Thomas Marshall, who was the vice president under Woodrow Wilson at the time, James Champ Clark, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives during the Wilson administration, John Wanamaker, Frank Vanderlip. Frank Vanderlip was actually on the board for Andrew Carnegie's. He had a foundation of all school college presidents that would give to help teachers for their cost of living. And Frank Vanderlip was his right-hand man. John Rockefeller responded, and Andrew Carnegie himself responded. So this book, which we'll see here in a minute, is evidence that he knew these people in addition to Woodrow Wilson. He also wrote the former President Theodore Roosevelt, who had his secretary write an endorsement under his name. So going on here, and you'll see this is an ad for his school held at the Bryan and Stratton Business College. And just continuing to scroll down, this is a picture of the book that he wrote in 1917 as evidence that it did exist. So this is the original 1917 version of How to Sell Your Services. And then you'll even see the inside cover here. And if you were to blow this up, you'll see that it says, with valuable advice from John D. Rockefeller, okay, Thomas Marshall, Vice President under Woodrow Wilson, It also has Andrew Carnegie listed there, as well as Thomas Edison and Frank A. Vanderlip, who was Andrew Carnegie's right-hand man. So it actually provides personal advice that they gave to Napoleon Hill, listed in the book right here. That it doesn't stop there though. There's even more evidence of that. So if we continue to read the story here, as president of George Washington Institute, Hill duplicated what he did at LaSalle and began selling shares of his school. Doing so guaranteed that institute that the doing so guaranteed that tuition would be paid by the dividends his students received. He then advertised enrollment in the school by mailing marketing letters to high school students across the country. So I'm just going to scroll down and skip over some of the steps here, some of the paragraphs, and go to where he is actually working directly with Woodrow Wilson. So prior to Hill incorporating George Washington Institute, which is what we've been talking about, him being the president of the school, just to give some background information, President Woodrow Wilson had entered America into World War I on April 6, 1917. At the start of the war, the U.S. Army had approximately 127,000 troops, which waned in comparison to the other countries involved. Therefore, President Wilson signed the Selective Service Act into law on May 18th of that year. The law mandated that citizens register to be drafted for military service. As a result of the draft, the Army grew to more than 4 million soldiers from 127,000. This sweeping selection of millions of men would cause Hill's school to falter because many of his students had also been drafted. He was then forced to discontinue all classes and write off $75,000 of tuition that was owed. So he took a great loss because that was over $1.5 million that he had to write off. To enforce the Selection Service Act, there were three draft registrations. The first draft was held on June 5th, 1917, and was reserved for men between 21 and 30 years old. The second draft was held on June 5th, 1918, and was reserved for men who had turned 21 after the previous draft. And the third draft was held on September 12th, 1918, who was reserved for men ages 18 through 45. Hill, Hill himself, being 34 at the time, was not exempt. Fresh off of the heels of his public dispute with a German spy, he too was drafted to serve in the military. However, he would not be sent overseas to fight. Instead, Hill would be assigned to work for President Wilson due to his prior association with him. Carnegie had introduced Hill to Wilson in 1909 when he was president of Princeton University. So President Woodrow Wilson used to be the president of Princeton University in 1909, and that's when Napoleon Hill first met him. And so when the draft happened, he was drafted, but he never was deployed overseas to fight. So we find out why that is here because we're going to take a look at Hill's Army draft card and show you what exactly he was doing instead of going off to fight in the war. So Wilson had also been on the board of the Carnegie Foundation at the time. So he was on the board of the Andrew Carnegie Foundation. So you know that Woodrow Wilson was a very close friend of Andrew Carnegie. And from my comment that I made on the first episode, we know that Andrew Carnegie was very close friends with Robert Taylor. Robert Taylor was the editor of Bob Taylor's magazine, which Napoleon Hill wrote an article for. And we have that article showing proof that he actually wrote for Bob Taylor magazine. And we have a newspaper article showing that Bob Taylor actually gave a eulogy for Andrew Carnegie while Andrew Carnegie was still alive, and also was the keynote speaker for Andrew Carnegie's organization's first annual banquet, the Optimist Club, for the Optimist Club. So President Wilson would task Hill with the distribution of propaganda to influence public opinion about the war. So this is what he did for President Wilson. As part of his assignment, President Wilson directed Hill to write speeches endorsing the war. He also instructed Hill to write newsletters to be displayed in industrial plants that made war equipment. Additionally, Hill showed public support for the war by marketing it as the war to end all wars, a phrase popularized by the H.G. Wells book of the same name. President Wilson then appointed Hill to work directly with Samuel Insull. Now, this is a key name and a key person here as further evidence, or the main evidence of how we know Hill knew and personally worked for President Woodrow Wilson. Insull was the chairman of the Illinois Council of Defense. The government organization had been formed by President Wilson to oversee the production of war equipment. So this Illinois Council of Defense was a government organization formed by President Wilson during World War One, and it oversaw production of war equipment. As you will read, Insull is a key figure in Hill's life who validates that he knew President Wilson as well as some other notable people. Hill worked under Insull's supervision at the Winslow Brothers Company. So Insull, it is proven and documented that Samuel Insull was actually over the war equipment department at a company called the Winslow Brothers Company in Chicago, Illinois. So they made weapons for use in the war. Hill's military draft card lists his position at Winslow Brothers as social director in munitions plans. As social director, Hill's job was to create enthusiasm and cooperation among the workers to keep them engaged in making war equipment. To do this, Hill had upbeat, inspirational music played in the plant and had the war news translated into comical cartoons. As a result of Hill's efforts, the workers moved more rapidly and increased the plant's production. On October 4th, 1918, Hill visited President Wilson in the White House. So this is just something that Hill claims himself in his memoirs. And so we'll see the connection between Hill and President Wilson here momentarily. During his visit, Germany would send a written request for a truce to the commander in chief. The president read the papers or the request, then replied to it with three questions. After reviewing Germany's request, he handed it to Napoleon Hill and asked him for any suggestions on responding. Hill suggested that Wilson also include a fourth question. His recommendation was to ask if their request for a truce was made because of the German army or for the German people. This indicated that the terms of the truce would mean getting rid of the German ruler, Frederick Wilhelm Victor Albert, also known as Kaiser Wilhelm II. Just 3 weeks later, Hill would welcome his youngest son, David, into the world on his 35th birthday. And I just stop here for a second to just mention that his youngest son, David, who was born on his birthday in 1918, is the father of a good friend of mine, James Blair Hill. So James Blair Hill, he lives in West Virginia and is Napoleon Hill's grandson. He's the son of David. And he's just been such a great support for my work and just encouraging me to do this research. So that is his son. And so that's somebody that I know personally today, and that's an honor. And so you'll see a picture of Woodrow Wilson and Andrew Carnegie together. So they're good, close, personal friends. And then I'll minimize it here because this is the key that puts it all together. This is Napoleon Hill's draft card. So I'll blow it up a little bit more. So what you'll notice is this is his draft registration card, Napoleon Hill. It shows his address here. And then here highlighted in yellow, it says that his occupation is social director and munitions plans for the Winslow Brothers Company. And it lists the address there. And so it is documented that Samuel Insull was the head over the War Department at the Winslow Brothers. And you have to ask yourself, why wasn't Napoleon Hill deployed? Why did he get assigned on his draft card to stay in Chicago where he lived at the time and work for the Winslow Brothers for a company that made war equipment for somebody who was a supervisor who worked in the Wilson administration? So it just seems to me that his story is checking out there. But it doesn't stop there. One of the key indicators, and I'll show you this article as well too. I'll actually zoom in just a bit. So this article is about the official writer for the White House is retiring after serving under every president since Woodrow Wilson. He is Andrew B. Tolley, a tall and dignified man of 68. So he was the official writer for the White House, starting with President Woodrow Wilson, right? And so you'll see down here the continuance of that. So this is official choreographer of White House honored. So it lists Andrew B. Tolley as the official choreographer for the White House. And then down here, we'll read this. The Success Club of Washington held its regular semi-monthly dinner and dance last night at the Highlands. The meeting developed into a surprise party for the founder of this club, Mr. Napoleon Hill, on the occasion of his birthday. At a previous meeting, resolutions were passed by the members commending Mr. Hill on the work that he was doing in teaching the law of success, which resolutions were beautifully engrossed by Mr. Adrian B. Tolley, the calligrapher for the White House, who started doing that under Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the first president to hire him to be in charge of the White House graphic designs of invitations and any stationery that would went out. He was the well-known government penman who engrosses the White House invitations and presented to Mr. Hill. So he actually made the birthday party invitations for Napoleon Hill as well too. So here is another person that Napoleon Hill knows. Not only is there proof that he knows Samuel Insull, there's proof that he knows Adrian B. Tolley as well too. Now, um, under this section, we learn a little bit about Samuel Insull as well too, and his connection with him, and it shows evidence that he actually knew Woodrow Wilson as well. So prior to serving President Wilson, Insull had been Thomas Edison's personal secretary. Edison then promoted him to president of the Chicago Edison Company. In addition to working for Edison, he was also a nationally recognized leader in the electric utility industry. Insull's utility company later failed as a result of the 1929 stock market crash. He was then indicted for mail fraud, embezzlement, and violations of federal bankruptcy law. So a lot of people will say because Hill was involved in some very controversial things, and that means he was a fraud. But here's somebody outside of his association with Napoleon Hill. He worked for Thomas Edison. He worked for in the Wilson administration, and he was actually indicted for mail fraud, embezzlement, and violent federal bankruptcy law. So the fact that you have a checkered past does not mean that there's no way that you would know men of renown who we say today are, men who have integrity and men that we have a lot of respect for because of their success. So I just wanted to make that side note because people act like because Napoleon Hill had some blemishes on his past, that he couldn't possibly know Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, President Wilson, or President Roosevelt. Now, in 1934, Samuel Insull was acquitted of all the charges, but remained a shell of his success until he died in 1938. Napoleon Hill mentions Insull's success on page 143 of Volume 8 in the original 1928 version of the Law of Success, writing, Samuel Insull was an ordinary stenographer in the employ of Thomas A. Edison. Through the aid of his imagination, he saw the great commercial possibilities of electricity, but he did more than see the possibilities. He reached the decision to transfer the mere possibilities into realities, and today he is a multimillionaire electric plant operator. So Hill addresses him knowing of Samuel Insull. He doesn't necessarily comment on him knowing him personally yet. Insull's fortune is also referenced on page 127 of Hill's biography of Lifetime of Riches, stating that incredible fortunes were being made in the U.S. securities market in 1928, 1929. Hot stocks like RCA actually quadrupled in value in the course of a year. Samuel Insull, owner of a vast empire utility companies, and one of Hill's Law of Success acquaintance. So here, the original biography of Napoleon Hill says Samuel Insull was one of Hill's Law of Success acquaintances, had a 50-day run in which the value of his securities increased by an estimated rate of $7,000 per minute, 24 hours a day. Hill then discusses Insull's financial demise on page 150 of Think and Grow Rich. So even in Think and Grow Rich, he discusses his relationship with Samuel Insull, writing that Samuel Insull lost his fortune of over $100 million. The Insull fortune was built on plans which were sound. The business depression forced Mr. Insull to change his plans, and the change brought temporary defeat because his new plans were not sound. Mr. Insull is now an old man, and he may consequently accept failure instead of temporary defeat. But if his experience turns out to be failure, it was for the reason that he lacks the fire of persistence to rebuild his plans. Now, additionally, on page 291 of his 1938 book, Outwitting the Devil, the original and edit complete text, Hill writes, Samuel Insull did not lose his $4 billion industrial empire as a result of the Depression. He began losing it before the Depression when he became the victim of a group of women who flattered him into turning his talents from the public utilities to grand opera. If ever a man in a high position in the financial world went down because of the power of drifting, hypnotic rhythm, and time, that man was Samuel Insull. I am writing from accurate knowledge of Mr. Insull and the causes of his troubles dating from that time that I served with him during the World War to the time of his ill-advised attempt to run away from himself. All right, so I'll read this sentence again. Napoleon Hill says, I am writing from accurate knowledge of Mr. Insull and the causes of his troubles dating from the time that I served with him during the World War, confirming that he served under Samuel Insull for the Winslow Brothers Company to the time of his ill-advised attempt to run away from himself. And so we'll find out more about that here in a minute, but this is Samuel Insull. He lived from November 11th, 1859 to July 16th, 1938. There's a picture of him again. This is a picture of him next to Thomas Edison. And then we'll see here Samuel Insull's relationship with Woodrow Wilson. So it just says the president sends later to Samuel Insull of the State Council of Defense. So President Wilson sends Samuel Insull a letter. So it's signed by Woodrow Wilson, which is addressed to Samuel Insull. So you know that he worked for Woodrow Wilson. And then you'll see here that the Illinois State Council of Defense, Samuel Insull was listed as the chairman as well. And one of the last things I want to mention before we end this video is you'll also see that another person who was on the Illinois State Council of Defense was J. Ogden Armour. Now, you'll notice in the first section of Think and Grow Rich, the story of Frank Gonzalez, a preacher who actually wanted $1 million to start a school. He wanted to start a vocational school, not just any school that had information, but more of a hands-on practical school, a vocational school. And he preached a sermon, and it was entitled, What I Would Do with $1 Million. And so he began to manifest that by speaking and saying out loud that he would have the $1 million by a certain amount of time. And when he preached his sermon, somebody mysteriously stood up in the audience and said, I'll give you $1 million for your school. And so we learned about that history a little bit here. So I'll just touch on that. So J. Ogden Armour is here. And so prior to serving on the Illinois State Council of Defense with Samuel Insull, Armour was the president of a famous meatpacking corporation, Armour and Company. The company had been founded by his father, Philip D. Armour, in 1867. All right. And so on page 13 of Think and Grow Rich, Hill lists J. Ogden Armour as one of the men he analyzed as part of his research for Andrew Carnegie. Hill had met Armour while he was working for Samuel Insull during his assignment for President Wilson. So you'll go down here. This is his father, Philip Armour. So although Philip Armour had found success as the owner of Armour and Company, he was also known for donating $1 million to start the Armour Institute of Technology after a pastor named Frank Gonzalez delivered a sermon in order to raise funds for a school he wanted to start. Armour approached the pulpit and offered him the full amount. So this is the man who raised his hand, said he would give $1 million to Frank Gonzalez. So there's a reason why Napoleon Hill lists this as the first story, not only in Think and Grow Rich, but also in The Law of Success. And here is Frank Gonzalez. So if we just read the caption about him, in 1890, Frank Gonzalez delivered a sermon entitled What I Would Do If I Had $1 Million to his congregation at Plymouth Church. During his exhortation, Gonzalez detailed his plans to start a school where students would learn by doing. One of the audience members was Philip Armour, who was inspired to give Gonzalez the money he needed. Philip's son, J. Ogden Armour, would later introduce Gonzalez to Napoleon Hill because Napoleon Hill worked for the Illinois Council of Defense. So, and he was in the administration for the Illinois Council of Defense along with Samuel Insull. So that is the department that Napoleon Hill worked for. And J. Ogden Armour would introduce Napoleon Hill to the man that his father gave $1 million to start a school and started a school with. After Gonzalez told him the story of Philip Armour giving him $1 million, Hill included it in his philosophy to illustrate the success principle of imagination. Gonzalez's story appears on page 3 in volume 1 of The Law of Success and on pages 136 to 140 of Thinking Grow Rich. So I'll stop sharing here. And I'll just leave you with this. I know a lot of people online or YouTube channels will say, hey, subscribe, click, share. I'm not going to tell you to do that. And I'll say this over and over again, but for me, you just get bombarded with so much information and so many emails and so many, notifications, a new video posted. I don't want you to be bombarded with that. And like my information is the most important thing that you can consume throughout the day. You have 24 hours in the day. I'd rather you focus on your goals. I'd rather you focus on something that is passionate, that you're passionate about. You know where to find me. The name of the channel, the Gospel of Napoleon Hill YouTube channel. And if you'd like to directly message me and reach out to me for a free PDF copy of the Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer, or have questions about any section of the book of if he really knew this or if he really did that, or if you heard any of the rumors at all about Napoleon Hill's misgivings, and you just have a question about that, I'd be more than happy to answer that. Just message me on the Gospel of Napoleon Hill Scholar or Scammer Facebook page as well. But other than that, I will see you on the next video. Take care, guys. Thanks.